Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and start the YouTube stream.
You're live.
Okay, good. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I think we have the bulk majority of everyone. Good morning. I'm Aaron Yao. I'm the designated federal officer for the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. In my role as DFO, I would like to formally open this public meeting. The CASAC is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. The CASAC is empowered under the Clean Air Act to provide independent advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical bases for EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards. FACA and EPA policy require that CASAC meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where DFO is present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. Today's meeting will be for the panel to receive a briefing from EPA on the ozone policy assessment. The panel will have another meeting from June 8th through 17th to peer review the ozone PA. There will be opportunities for oral public comments during the meeting on June 8th. As noted in the Federal Register, members of the public wishing to provide oral public comments should contact me by June 1st to be placed on the list of public speakers. Written public comments will be accepted throughout the advisory process, but to have the greatest consideration by the panel prior to deliberations, they should be submitted by June 1st. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussion and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA. I will work with the chair to certify the minutes and have them posted on the CASAC website. The CASAC consists of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. As government employees, the members are subject to all applicable ethics laws in implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a loss of impartiality under federal ethics regulations relating to the topic of this meeting. For those on the phone, I would like to note that we have a live video webcast of this meeting. To access it, go to casac.epa.gov, then click on today's meeting, and you should see the link to the live video webcast. To those watching the live video webcast, please send me an email indicating your attendance. If you had previously requested a call-in number, you do not need to email me again. I would now like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Leanne Shepard, Chair of the CASAC.
Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to have us all together to start this new process. So today's purpose, as I think Aaron already mentioned, is to get a briefing from EPA about the ozone policy assessment. And before we do that, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. And the introductions, I ask if at all possible, you turn on your video, at least while you're speaking, and that you share your name, your affiliation, and some brief comments about your expertise. I'll go through the panelists on the order that is listed on the agenda. So my name is Leanne Shepard, as you know, and I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I have appointments in both biostatistics and in environmental and occupational health sciences. And I'm trained as a biostatistician, and my areas of expertise are particularly in exposure and assessment and modeling, and how that affects our ability to draw conclusions from environmental and occupational epidemiologic studies. So I now like to invite George Allen to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. George Allen, I'm the chief scientist at NESCOM, that's in Boston. I'm a former chartered CASAC member. That was during the 2010 to 2014 ozone review and the reconsideration that ended in 2011, and also a member of several CASAC panels since 2004. My expertise. Oh, are we good? All right. My expertise is in measurement methods and exposure assessment.
Thank you, George. Ed Aval.
Good morning. My name is Ed Aval. I'm a professor at the Department of Population and Public Health Sciences at USC in Southern California. My areas of expertise are in exposure assessment and chronic and acute health research. And I've been on previous CASAC panels a couple of cycles ago looking at NOx, SOx, PM, and ozone. I served on the previous ozone panel in 2000, 12 to 15.
Thank you. Jim Boylan. Is Jim here?
Yep.
There it is.
Hi, everyone. Jim Boylan. I'm the Assistant Branch Chief for the Air Protection Branch with the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. And my expertise is ambient monitoring, emissions inventory development, and photochemical and dispersion modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. Judy Chow.
Hi, everyone. My name is Judy Chow. I'm a research professor in the Division of Atmospheric Sciences. That's a research institute. We're part of a Nevada system of higher education. My research interest has been on air quality monitoring, measurement method, data analysis, and the receptor modeling, source apportionment.
Thank you. Mark Frampton.
Hi, I'm Mark Frampton. I'm from University of Rochester, a professor emeritus in the Pulmonary and Critical Care Division. And my area of research has been the human health effects of air pollution, with most of my work on ozone, PM, and NO2 toxicology. And I'm a chartered member of CASAC and have served on previous CASAC review committees for, I think, PM and NO2.
Thank you. Christina Fuller.
Good morning. My name is Christina Fuller, and I'm an associate professor at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. And I have training in both exposure assessment and environmental epidemiology. My expertise within that is looking at exposure disparities and measuring those over space and time, environmental justice, and community-based participatory research. And I'm a chartered CASAC member and just participated in the particular matter panel.
You, Terry Gordon.
Hi, I'm at NYU School of Medicine. I'm an inhalation toxicologist, and I've been on 3 or 4 ad hoc CASAC panels in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Catherine Carr.
Hello, everybody. Catherine here at the University of Washington. I'm appointed in the Department of Pediatrics and Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. My training is as a pediatrician and an environmental epidemiologist, and my expertise is in the area of early life exposure to indoor and outdoor air pollution and effects on child respiratory health.
Thank you. Michael Kleinman.
Good morning. I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the University of California, Irvine. My expertise is in inhalation toxicology, and I've served on a few of the CASAC panels in the past.
Thank you. Danica Lombardozzi. Is Dr. Lombardozzi here?
She won't be on today.
Oh, okay, thank you. Howard Neufeld.
Hi, good morning. I'm a professor of biology at Appalachian State University. My expertise is in plant ecophysiology, and my research has involved the responses of trees and native wildflowers to ozone, much of it done in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer Peel.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jennifer Peel. I'm a professor of epidemiology at Colorado State University in the Colorado School of Public Health. And I'm an environmental epidemiologist with a focus primarily on the health effects of outdoor and household air pollution.
Thank you. Richard Peltier.
Good morning. My name is Rick Peltier. I'm an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts. By training, I'm an atmospheric chemist, and I do empirical measurement work of PM and ozone gases and so forth. But I call myself an exposure scientist because I do ambient and personal monitoring.
You, Alexandra Panet-Gonzalez.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm an associate professor of geography at the University of North Texas, and I focus on air pollution impacts on ecosystems.
Thank you. Jeremy Sarnat.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy Sarnat at Emory University. My field of interest is in air pollution exposure and epidemiology, increasingly using molecular level methods, indicators of exposure and response. I've been on a couple of KSAC panels, including the PM panel, which I haven't recovered yet. So.
Right, thank you, Jeremy. Jason West.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all and to meet some of you. I'm in environmental sciences and engineering at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. That's in the Gilling School of Global Public Health. I'm a computer modeler, and I've done work to model ozone on urban, regional, national, and global scales. My work has involved ozone radiative forcing, but also we've done a lot of work to understand the distribution of ozone globally and to use models in health impact assessment and policy analysis. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's the panel. So now I think I'll turn the meeting over to Dr. Erica Sasser to introduce herself and her team and to give the EPA presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Shepard. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Erica Sasser. I am the Director of the Health and Environmental Impacts Division, which is in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. And it's my team that is principally responsible for the policy assessment portion and the regulatory portion of the NAAQS, but we do work very closely with ORD throughout the review. And I will introduce folks in just a moment. First, though, let me thank both the KSAC and the panel. We have met recently with the lead panel just a couple of weeks ago, and I do appreciate the amount of time and effort that both the core KSAC, and I should note I'm getting a internet connection unstable note, so if I disappear, I apologize. But we really are aware of how much effort goes into the work that the committee and the panels do on each review. And so I want to thank you in advance for what I know is going to be a journey together where we will depend a lot on your input. So thank you for the time you're going to invest in this process. And let me move to the next slide and introduce to you the team who, many of whom are on the phone today and will be able to answer questions. Some of them will actually be giving presentations as we go along. So you'll see some of these faces throughout the day. And what I'd like to do is introduce the OAR team and then turn it over to Steve Dutton so he can introduce the ORD team. And folks, I would ask EPA folks, if you're on the phone, and if you're on the video, if you could please turn your camera on when I mention your name, just so that the panel and the committee can put a name with a face, that would be great. So first, let me start with Karen Wesson. Karen Wesson is the group leader for the Ambient Standards Group. Karen's group oversees the entire NAAQS process. They are involved in every review and are responsible ultimately for the policy assessment and the rulemaking of each pollutant. And for this review, for this reconsideration, we have two new staff leads. We have Lee Meyer and Mary Hudson. They are going to be with us throughout not only today's meeting, but the June meetings, and they will be leading a lot of the discussions on the policy assessment. And we also have Deirdre Murphy. Many of you know Deirdre already and saw her a couple weeks ago because she is the lead on lead, but she also was the lead on the 2020 ozone review. So Deirdre will be assisting throughout the process. We also have Bob Wayland. He is the group leader for our Risk and Benefits Group. The Risk and Benefits Group is responsible for the quantitative assessments that support each NAAQS review. So John Langstaff, who's next on the list, works for Bob, and John is our exposure expert and our risk modeler. So both of them will be with us to explain the quantitative aspects of the review. And last, we have Ben Wells, who is the lead on air quality and has been very involved in supporting the updates to the air quality information in the draft PA. So with that, let me turn it over to Steve for a minute so that he can introduce himself and his team.
Thank you, Erica. And I echo Erica's appreciation for the time and effort that the CASAC is putting into meeting with us this morning and continuing in June. As Erica mentioned, we've been meeting with several of you many times recently for lead and PM, and I know that that's a significant contribution of your time and effort, but it's incredibly helpful to us as we develop these various documents. So I am Steve Dutton. I am the director of the Health and Environmental Effects Assessment Division, which is in the Office of Research and Development. And as Erica mentioned, we work very closely with OAR on developing our components, different components to the NAAQS. In ORD, we focus on the science, integrated science assessment and science support side. And I have on the call here today on Zoom, but also listening in the background, we have a number of folks from our division available, including a couple of folks who have worked on some updates and provisional assessments that we've done since we released the 2020 ISA. But we also have several key members from who helped develop our 2020 integrated science assessment. So I will turn it back over to Erica, and thank you for that introduction.
Thanks, Steve. And I do also want to mention that we have with us our attorneys for this review, Melina Williams and David Orlin, who are always very instrumental as we move forward, especially during the rulemaking phase. And I want to acknowledge their strong support of this team. Okay, next slide, please. So many of you will have seen some of the material in this presentation very recently, and those of you who have been on previous panels or have been on the core CASAC also will be familiar with the NAAQS process. We do, however, want to be sure that any new members also are aware of both the statutory constraints that we are working within and the general procedural guidelines before we get into the meat of today's discussion. So I'm going to give just a brief overview of the topics you see here. And then following this, there will be a much more detailed presentation on the contents of the draft policy assessment. Next slide, please. So first of all, just in terms of what we are attempting to do throughout this review, the Clean Air Act requires us to set the NAAQS and revise them as appropriate every 5 years. And that includes both the primary health-based standards and the secondary welfare-based standards. The primary standards are required to be standards that, in the judgment of the administrator, are requisite to protect public health with an adequate margin of safety. And in evaluating those, in formulating those judgments, we are largely looking at the science and considering factors such as the nature of the health effects, the size of the populations at risk, their estimated exposure levels, and the degree of scientific uncertainty related to the potential occurrence of these adverse health effects. Public health protection is intended for adverse effects. So we're very much focused on not just what is a measurable effect, but what is actually considered adverse from a public health perspective. And we also put a lot of attention on sensitive at-risk population groups. And I want to emphasize that this is groups and not individuals. And of course, for ozone, we're focused very much on children and people with asthma. The secondary standards, again, are standards that in the judgment of the administrator are requisite to protect public welfare. There's a long list of welfare effects that are specified in the Act. Those are listed here. In most reviews and most secondary reviews, there are certain types of welfare effects that are that kind of rise to the top as being more strongly associated with that pollutant or more clearly adverse. Here, we're very much focused on effects on vegetation. And there's always a significant judgment with regard to what constitutes an adverse effect to public welfare. It requires a degree of policy judgment as well as scientific evidence. Okay, next slide, please. So as a basis for informing the decisions on the standards, EPA issues air quality criteria. And of course, this is what we call the integrated science assessment. So it's intended to encompass the latest scientific knowledge that is useful in indicating the kind and extent of all identifiable effects on public health or welfare. So it's a very comprehensive document. I'm sure many of you are, if you have ever printed out an ISA, it is quite a tome, but it is intended to be quite comprehensive and also to provide a synthesis. And Steve's going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. The term requisite, which was mentioned on the previous slide, both standards need to be requisite to protect public health or welfare. That term has been interpreted to mean sufficient, but not more stringent than necessary. The Clean Air Act does not require us to eliminate all risk, and the courts have said that zero risk standards are neither possible nor required. The adequate margin of safety requirement is intended to address uncertainties that are associated with evidence that is not conclusive, and also to provide a degree of protection against hazards that may not yet have been identified or fully understood. The courts have provided some additional guidance through the long history of litigation on this program. EPA is required to engage in reasoned decision-making and translating scientific evidence into standards, and we also cannot consider cost. So cost doesn't come into the equation until we start thinking about how to implement a revised standard. And with regard to the role of CASAC, I mentioned that we do review both the underlying criteria and the standards every 5 years. And throughout the process, we are seeking advice from CASAC. The Clean Air Act specifies that CASAC's job is to recommend to the administrator any revisions to the underlying criteria, any revisions to the underlying ISA, as well as revisions on the standards themselves that may be appropriate. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a brief schematic that outlines the various stages of the review. Obviously, because this is a reconsideration, we're sort of jumping into the middle. Normally, we have a planning phase that then leads into the assessment phase. The assessment phase is the longest part of the review. That's when the ISA is compiled, the quantitative assessments are done, and the policy assessment is put together. And that's usually 3 to 4 years of time, the bulk of the review, as I said. Throughout both the planning and assessment phases, we're engaging with CASAC, relying on CASAC advice, trying to make sure that the information that we ultimately give to the EPA administrator is, reflecting the best science and the risks to public health and welfare. After the assessment phase is over, we enter the formal rulemaking phase, where we would actually propose a decision, which might be to retain, might be to revise, and we go through a process that I'll talk more about in just a minute. And of course, throughout all of these phases, we are also engaged with the public. We have public comment periods, and we invite the public to comment on the various documents, as well as on any ultimate proposal. Next slide, please. Right. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk a little bit about the ISA.
Okay, great. Thank you, Erica. So yeah, as Erica mentioned, we're kind of jumping in the middle of this process, but we're going to walk you through the whole process just so you see kind of how things came together as we developed the integrated science assessment and other documents in the last review. So as I mentioned, my division is responsible for developing the integrated science assessments, which contain a comprehensive evaluation and synthesis of the most policy relevant scientific information. And it serves as the scientific foundation for the next review. The ISAs include a characterization of the scientific evidence, including the strengths and uncertainties, conclusions on causality, assessment of dose or concentration response relationships, and the characterization of evidence for at-risk populations, life stages, or ecosystems. The ISAs, including the recently completed 2020 Ozone ISA, are assembled using a systematic and consistent approach developed over the years in close consultation with CASAC, including many on this call here today, over about the last 15 years. And this approach is described in what's now a standalone companion document called the Preamble to the ISA. And it's available at the link shown in the bottom corner of this slide. The figure on this slide is taken from the preamble, and it really shows kind of at a high level the process we go through for developing an ISA. It begins with a broad literature search and a methodical and guided screening process that we go through. Studies that advance through that screening process, we are evaluated for individual study quality before being cited and characterized further in the ISA. The studies cover a very broad range of disciplines, as you can imagine, including epidemiology, toxicology, controlled human exposure, dosimetry, terrestrial and aquatic ecology, atmospheric sciences, and exposure assessment. These individual studies from these disciplines are then integrated, and that's a really important part of what we do in the ISA, is to integrate across these disciplines to form a body of evidence that then supports our conclusions. And these include judgments regarding causality for a range of health and welfare effects, as well as other policy relevant conclusions on dose response relationships and at-risk populations. The draft ISA then undergoes very careful review by CASAC, as Erica mentioned, with input provided by the public, as shown in the green box at the bottom of this figure. All that input is taken into careful consideration in revising the ISA before developing the final document, which is used to inform the quantitative assessments, if warranted, and the policy assessment that Erica's division takes the lead on. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Erica for the next slide.
So based on the information in the integrated science assessment, EPA typically prepares quantitative assessments, and the nature of the quantitative assessment depends on the pollutant and the nature of the effects and the type of information that we have to work with. In the case of ozone, we did both quantitative risk and exposure assessments, and we did quantitative assessments for both health and welfare-based endpoints. So we have quite a bit of quantitative information in this review. We will talk through that in detail going forward. It does vary based on the review. Sometimes we do more or less of that type of quantitative work, but here we have quite a bit. And the results of these assessments are sometimes housed in a standalone risk and exposure assessment document, and sometimes they're included in the policy assessment. And in this case, we have included them in the policy assessment. And I think in general, we have moved more in this direction because by joining the risk assessment and the policy considerations around that quantitative assessment, we feel that we're better able to inform the decisions on the standards. So we've moved more towards including them in an integrated fashion, but it does still depend on the review. And the slide, the graphic here just outlines some of the major inputs into the risk assessment, including air quality modeling and monitoring information, exposure modeling, dosimetry modeling, and then of course, ultimately the risk assessment and characterization that we have for individual endpoints. Next slide, please. So then the rest of the policy, the role of the policy assessment is intended to bridge the gap between the science and the ultimate decisions that the administrator has to make. But in addition to the quantitative work I just mentioned, the rest of the policy assessment is focused on drawing together the evidence from the ISA and putting it in context with the quantitative information and helping the administrator draw conclusions about what might be appropriate with regard to the standards themselves. So we look very much at the first question we ask ourselves is, does the available evidence and quantitative information call into question the adequacy of the existing standards? based on, all the factors that you see listed in that top blue box. And if the answer is yes, then we move forward to consider potentially revised standards. And if the answer is no, then we might consider retaining the existing standards. And of course, this is the considerations here include not just the level of the standard, but other aspects of the standard as well, including averaging time, indicator, and form. Okay, I think we can move on. Okay, so after the policy assessment is done, as I said, that's intended to bridge the gap between the ISA and the rulemaking process. We move here into the regulatory portion of the review, and this is a very typical formal process that involves interagency engagement. So there's a notice that's formulated, it goes through interagency review and OMB. Then we issue a proposed decisions, we take public comment, we have public hearings, and then we formulate a final decision and final notice. At this point, the Case Act's role is largely done. So your input comes at the earlier stages in the review. In this case, it's concentrated on the draft policy assessment document. And by the time we get to rulemaking, Case Act has completed their advice to the agency. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me just briefly talk about the 2020 review. So we are starting today with an integrated science assessment that was completed in 2020. And we found in that document that the science really was very consistent with what we had available in 2015. So the strongest evidence still being for respiratory effects caused by short-term ozone exposures, including various health outcomes associated with asthma exacerbation in children with asthma. The newly available respiratory information did not include average exposure concentrations lower than those we had previously evaluated for the effects in controlled human exposure studies, and they did not identify different or new population groups to be at increased risk. So the evidence on the respiratory front was largely consistent. We did have new information on metabolic effects, and that was a new causal determination. It was upgraded to likely to be causal, with the strongest evidence there being provided by the animal toxicology studies. The other evidence that shifted significantly in the ISA in 2020 was the change in the cardiovascular effects causal determination, which was changed from likely to be causal in the previous review to be suggestive in the current review. So we also did a number of updates to the quantitative exposure and risk analysis. Again, the general outline of the analysis was consistent with what we had done in the 2015 review, but we did new work to reduce uncertainty, and we found that the new estimates were largely consistent with what we had seen in the 2015 review in terms of the types of exposures that we would expect, the types of health endpoints that we would expect to see, and so on. And we'll talk through that in a lot more detail going forward. Next slide, please. The secondary standard, the ISA again found that the scientific evidence available in the 2020 review was largely consistent with what we had in 2015, with the strongest evidence, as I said earlier, being for vegetation effects. The new information did not modify the exposure response relationships for plant growth effects that we had focused on in the 2015 review. And there were some new categories of welfare effects that we explored in the ISA, but they were not, the evidence for those was emerging and relatively new. We didn't always have strong exposure response information. So that meant that when we got to the quantitative risk and exposure analysis, We focused again on the same types of effects that we had seen in the 2015 review. However, we did do some additional work because there had been some questions that had arisen with regard to the extent to which the W126, the form of the standard is an 8-hour form. The question was whether that 8-hour form provided protection against cumulative exposures as measured by a W126 index, and also against peak exposures, which were considered potentially strongly impacting vegetation. So we did some new work on that. Next slide, please. The CASAC advice on the primary standard was mixed. Some members of CASAC supported retaining the existing standard. Some supported consideration of revising the standard to a lower level. And on the secondary standard, there was general consensus for retaining the existing standard without revision. And ultimately in 2020, the proposed and final decisions were to retain both the primary and the secondary standards. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the standards themselves. They're obviously set at a level of 70 parts per billion, both primary and secondary, measured as an 8-hour average, with the form being the annual fourth highest daily maximum. Always a mouthful, but that is the current standard, and that is what is under consideration here. And I believe, let's see, the next slide is about the reconsideration. So now we're going to turn the page a little bit. We're going to talk about the decision to reconsider. This was announced last October. The administrator made a decision to reconsider the 2020 decision on the grounds that he wanted to make sure that the review had adhered to the strongest standards of scientific integrity and provided ample opportunity for public input and engagement. And consistent with that commitment, the administrator felt it was important to establish an ozone panel to make sure that the CASAC had a full suite of experts to provide advice on the draft policy assessment. So that is the panel in front of us today. We're very grateful again for your service here. The draft policy assessment that we're going to be discussing in more detail in just a minute presents an evaluation of the policy relevant aspects of the existing literature. So it's based largely on the 2020 ISA, and also on the quantitative exposure and risk analyses in the 2020 PA with some updates that we'll tell you about. And we're focused again on implications with regard to the adequacy of the current standards. And our goal is to complete this by the end of 2023. So now I think I'm going to turn it back to Steve. He's going to talk a little bit more about the approach to reviewing the science.
Thank you, Erica. So as Erica mentioned, the evidence base for this reconsideration of the ozone decision will include the complete scientific record that was included in the air quality criteria for the 2020 review. So this includes the recently completed 2020 ozone integrated science assessment, which, as Erica mentioned, kind of built on and carried forward information from the previous 2023 ozone ISA. And the agency has made the decision to base this reconsideration on the existing scientific record, given the recent completion of the ISA, as well as the general findings that Erica mentioned that in the 2020 review, that the broad scientific understanding of short and long-term health effects of ozone and the effects of welfare, including vegetation and ecosystems, changed very little between 2023 and 2020. So this position was also supported by 2 targeted provisional evaluations that our office has conducted, both of those concluding that the newly published information did not materially change any of the broad conclusions of the 2020 ISA, and thus did not warrant reopening the air quality criteria. I'll take just a moment to describe those 2 provisional evaluations here. You have those available to you to look through as well. And they are posted in the Ozone docket for the public as well. The first is an evaluation that we conducted in 2020 that focused specifically on studies that were submitted as public comments in the 2020 rulemaking. And the second is a more targeted evaluation we did just recently, focusing on the controlled human exposure studies published since the 2020 ISA. If we jump to the next slide, I will go into both those provisional evaluations in just a little bit more detail. So the 2020 provisional evaluation covered 74 new studies that were 74 studies, I should say, that were submitted in public comments. Some of them were new, some were older. And those were public comments that were received during the 2020 proposed rulemaking. 65 of those were health-based studies from a variety of different health disciplines, and 9 were ecology studies looking at a variety of different ecology disciplines. All of them were evaluated, and as I mentioned, the general conclusion drawn from that provisional evaluation was that none of these studies materially changed the broad scientific conclusions of the 2020 ISA. In 2022, we just wrapped up another provisional evaluation, and this was focusing specifically on the controlled human exposure studies that have come out as of recently, and looking at both respiratory and cardiovascular effects. We looked very carefully at these types of studies, given that they're have a lot of potential for identifying direct effects of ozone on humans, and may have a high impact on our causality determinations if there was any new evidence there. And their utility in providing kind of that direct information on dose response relationships for ozone exposure in humans. A systematic approach was used to identify, select, and evaluate the new literature. And through this process, which is described in detail in the memo, we ended up looking at 8 new controlled human exposure studies. So those were split roughly equally between cardiovascular endpoints and respiratory endpoints, with one of the studies looking at both cardiovascular and respiratory endpoints. As a whole, after evaluating these 8 new studies, it was again concluded that none of these new studies materially changed any of the broad scientific conclusions of the 2020 ISA regarding respiratory or cardiovascular effects on ozone. So again, these 2 provisional memos support the agency's decision to base this reconsideration on the scientific record that was included in the 2020 review, including the 2020 Integrated Science Assessment, which you have available to you. And with that, I will hand it back over to Erica to finish out this introductory presentation with the kind of high-level overview of the approach taken for the policy assessment.
Thanks, Steve. And I do want to point out that we figured that those memos would be of interest to the CASAC and the panel, and so we did attach them, and you should have them with the documents that were transmitted yesterday. So it's sort of in conclusion here, in a nutshell, the draft policy assessment that's in front of you draws very heavily from the 2020 policy assessment. And the scientific evidence base is that was encapsulated in the 2020 ISA. With regard to air quality exposure and risk analyses, we want to note that for the primary standard, the exposure and risk analyses in the new policy, the new draft policy assessment, the 2022 draft, are those that were presented in the 2020 PA. So they've just been carried forward. But for the secondary standard, there are some changes, and that relates to comments that we got in the rulemaking phase and additional analyses that we did as part of the 2020 review, but after the close of the policy assessment. So those are now folded into the new draft policy assessment that you have in front of you. And we've also updated the air quality data in that assessment. All right, next slide, please. So just to give you a snapshot of the planned schedule for the reconsideration, as I mentioned earlier, we announced this last October. We've been working hard to get to the release of the draft document that you now have in front of you. And we look forward to our meetings in June, where we will hear your advice and reflections on that document. We are hoping that we will be able to move then into finalizing that document and proposing a decision by approximately a year from now. So sometime next spring, with a final by the end of 2023. Next slide. Okay, there are a few items here in the supplementary material that I don't think we need to go into. The history of the standards, in particular, I will leave that for your reading pleasure. And I will now turn the meeting over back to Dr. Shepard, I believe.
All right, thank you very much to Erica and Steve. I want to see if there are any clarifying questions from the panel members. I see Jeremy has his hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. So, Erica, it's correct to say that the policy assessment includes the provisional data that Steve was talking about in its analyses and in the ones that we'll be reviewing for both the primary and secondary standards?
So we did not, so based on ORD's review of those studies that were identified and provisionally assessed in those two memos, they did not feel that the scientific record, the scientific basis for the review needed to be altered. So the assessment reflects only the scientific evidence that is in the 2020 ISA.
I got it. So the more recent studies are not included in analyses in the policy assessment that we'll be reviewing.
They would be, right, the thought would be they would be folded into the next review because they did not materially change the conclusions in the current review.
Okay, thank
you. Jennifer.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on that point just to clarify. I believe the memo from Dr. Lubin was in December of 2020. And so is it correct to state that we're not to consider any of the literature after that date in our discussions?
I think the way we would answer that is that the CASAC is always welcome to identify studies that you think we need to consider, whether they're older studies that we somehow failed to give adequate weight to or failed to include, or whether they are new information that you believe will fundamentally change conclusions. That is always something that we ask the CASAC to identify. Public commenters also often submit studies that they think that we should consider further.
Right, thank you. Jeremy has another question.
All right, this is my last one for this section, I promise. And this is going to sound like a loaded question, but it's not. It's just really curiosity here. But apparently, the what you said, the basis for the reconsideration of the standard was made by the administrator on the rationale that they wanted to adhere to rigorous standards of scientific integrity. Was there a reason to believe that the previous review of the ISA or the ISA itself was done not with rigorous scientific standards? I don't quite understand like the rationale behind the reconsideration decision.
I think the administrator's concern was prompted in part by the CASAC itself expressing a view that it did not have sufficient expertise. This occurred in both Ozone and PM. And I think it was a real concern about whether the advice that the agency received at that time reflected a full evaluation of all the science.
Okay.
To reconsider was we just want to take another look. It doesn't mean that we will reach different conclusions. It means that we want to be sure that there is full scientific weight behind the review.
And I would just add to that the ISA, for the 2020 review was under an accelerated timeline. But as I laid out all those steps, we went through all the steps that we would typically do on a normal timeline for the ISA. And so, ORD definitely stands behind that document and the conclusions drawn in there.
Thank you. Terry. You're muted, Terry.
So if I'm understanding the answer to Jeremy's question, the PA has not been changed by any new evaluations of any of the studies, any new studies, and that this reconsideration is just based on the expertise of a real and expanded panel, that nothing else has changed? Is the PA the same as it was before?
The primary standards information is largely the same.
Okay.
The secondary standards information has been updated with some of those new analyses I mentioned, things that we had done between proposal and final in the rulemaking phase that never came before CASAC. So
Okay.
to be sure that you had that information.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any comments or questions? All right, seeing none, I think maybe we turn this back to Erica and your staff for the next part of your presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We're going to move into a detailed presentation on the policy assessment itself. And I see Mary Hudson has popped on, so I will turn it over to Mary.
Yes, if we can get the next set of slides up, that would be great. Thank you. So, in this next presentation, we're going to go into a little bit more detail on the draft policy assessment. During this presentation, you'll hear from me as well as Lee Meyer and Deirdre Murphy. So next slide, please. So this is a general overview or outline of the presentation. First, we'll start with a couple of slides to orient you with regard to the policy assessment and reconsideration. Then Deirdre and I will go through several slides on the primary standard and then turn it over to Lee to discuss the secondary standard. And lastly, I'll note that there's an appendix that has a few extra slides for your reference. Next slide. So this policy assessment for the reconsideration, as Erica mentioned, has been developed to fulfill the same role as any policy assessment in any NAAQS review. Its purpose is to provide the staff evaluations to help bridge the gap between the relevant scientific information and the quantitative assessments and judgments required of the administrator in considering the protection provided by the current standards and whether or not they should be retained or revised. Also, as mentioned in the first presentation, this draft policy assessment draws on the available scientific evidence evaluated in the 2020 ISA and the policy relevant quantitative air quality exposure and risk analyses. Another role, as mentioned before, for the policy assessment is to facilitate advice to the PA and recommendations to the administrator from CASAC. And then finally, when the PA is finished and fully reviewed, it will be based on the ISA, the quantitative analyses, and be informed by the advice and recommendations from CASAC, as well as the public comments on the draft PA. Next slide. So this slide just lays out the general organization of the draft document. First, there is a short introduction chapter, which covers the purpose of the policy assessment, the legislative requirements, the history on ozone, criteria, and standards through the 2020 decision, and then ends with a section describing the process for the reconsideration of that decision. There's an air quality chapter with a lot of technical information on ozone quality, including information on sources and emissions of ozone precursors, ambient monitoring requirements and monitoring networks, data handling conventions, as well as status and trends information for ozone concentrations across the country. And lastly, there's a section detailing an analysis of background ozone concentrations. The third chapter focuses on the primary standard. It begins with a background for the existing standard, which was, as we all have heard, was set in 2015. Then there's a short section on the general approach and the key issues. It then moves to the health effects evidence and exposure risk information. and it's followed by a section on the key considerations and the preliminary conclusions. The chapter ends with a section identifying areas for future research. The last chapter on the secondary standard has a similar organization to chapter 3, but obviously focuses on welfare effects. So next slide, please. So the staff evaluation in this draft policy assessment, as in all policy assessments, is focused on this initial overarching question that Erica had mentioned, and it's worth mentioning again. And it's do the available scientific evidence and exposure risk-based information call into question the adequacy of the public health and welfare protection afforded by the current primary and secondary ozone standards? So to address this question, the draft PA presents the preliminary staff conclusions supported by the available scientific evidence and any quantitative assessments. Next slide. So as we've said, the current primary standard was established in 2015, and this was based primarily on health effects evidence of respiratory effects and on exposure risk analyses with a focus on analyses that estimated exposures of children and children with asthma at or above certain benchmark exposure concentrations. These estimates were drawn from controlled human exposure studies, and you will hear more about these studies later on in the presentation. As mentioned earlier, the draft PA relies on the 2020 ISA as the scientific evidence base, and the exposure risk analyses from the 2020 policy assessment. And so as such, this draft policy assessment for the reconsideration draws heavily from the 2020 PA and identifying and summarizing the key issues related to the reconsideration of the decision on the primary standard. Next slide. So in the next several slides, we'll discuss the health effects evidence and then I'll follow up with the quantitative risk analyses, but first we'll focus on the health effects. So remember the overarching question in the draft PA asks about the available scientific evidence and exposure risk-based information calling into question the adequacy of the public health protection afforded by the current primary standard. In addressing this question with regard to the scientific evidence, the draft policy assessment considers a series of more specific questions. For example, with regard to the indicator, are there photochemical oxidants or other than ozone in the ambient air that have the potential for human exposures and health effects? What are the health effects associated with ozone exposures? What are the public health implications to at-risk populations, and how big are these populations? And what exposure concentrations are associated with health effects? And what are important new or remaining uncertainties for the 2015 review? Next slide. So keeping in mind those questions, this slide is an overview of the health effects evidence. As in the 2015 review, the draft policy assessment recognizes that the health effect evidence continues to be strongest for respiratory effects. For example, there's a causal relationship between short-term exposure and respiratory effects, and there's a likely causal relationship for such effects with long-term exposures. The strongest evidence comes from controlled human exposure studies. There are EPI studies that also report associations between short-term exposures and respiratory hospital admissions, as well as emergency department visits. The lung function decrements and so backing up, so the lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms are the key adverse respiratory effects documented in the controlled human exposure studies, specifically in studies of healthy adults while exercising. For example, there's statistically significant changes in both lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms in 6.6 hour exposure studies while exercising at or above 73 parts per billion, while similar exposure designs at 60 parts per billion find statistically significant lung function decrements. Studies with the same exposure design at 80 parts per billion document a greater lung function decrements, and respiratory symptom scores, as well as other respiratory response indicators. And as in the 2015 review, the at-risk populations continue to include people with asthma, children, and outdoor workers. And finally, there are still some uncertainties regarding the population and groups that may be at greatest risk and the extent of the effects at lower ozone concentrations. So now I will turn it over to Deirdre Murphy to review the risk and exposure analyses.
Thank you, Mary. So first, I want to note that, as you've already heard, the population exposure and risk assessment presented in the draft PA was completed in 2020 and also presented in the 2020 PA. A cross-division team at OAQPS developed this assessment. The team was comprised of air quality modelers and statisticians, including Shannon Koplitz, Heather Simon, and Ben Wells, and exposure and risk modelers and assessors, including John Langstaff, and led by Dr. Stephen Graham. So with regard to the design of the assessment, it employs a case study approach involving 8 metropolitan study areas. In each study area, ambient air concentrations are estimated by an approach based on both monitoring data and air quality modeling. Population exposures are estimated by exposure modeling of simulated individuals moving through time and space. Risk is characterized in 2 different ways. The first involves comparing estimated exposures at elevated ventilation rate to benchmarks drawn from controlled human exposure studies that have reported increases in an array of effects and severity with increasing concentrations. The second type of risk characterization utilizes estimated exposures and ventilation rates in a model to estimate risk of lung function decrements, so it's slightly more focused. In considering the analyses, the draft PA addresses a series of specific questions. What is the magnitude of population exposure and risk estimated for simulated populations in different study areas, most specifically under conditions just meeting the current standard? What are the key uncertainties? And what is the public health importance of estimated exposures for at-risk populations? Next slide. So the next few slides provide a little more detail on the components of the assessment. The 8 study areas were selected to meet several criteria. Each has at least 10 ambient ozone monitors operating for the 2015-2017 period, which was the focus period for the assessment. In each area, the monitor design values ranged between 60 and 80 part per billion. So they were plus or minus 10 part per billion around the level of the standard, very close to just meeting the standard. The population in the CSAs and MSAs that are represented by the study areas range in size from 2 to 10 million in population. And we also considered the air quality model performance and the geographic distribution of study areas across the US. Next slide. So the ambient air concentrations were estimated in each area for each air quality scenario using a 3-step approach. In the first, ambient air monitoring data provide fine-scale temporal and broad spatial variability for each area. Secondly, air quality modeling is used to inform adjustments of hourly concentrations observed at monitor sites such that the highest study area design value met each air quality scenario target. And lastly, spatial interpolation was employed to estimate ozone concentrations for a fine-scale census tract level spatial variability. The result is a data set of hourly ozone concentrations in each census tract for each study area and air quality scenario. The air quality scenarios included conditions that just meet this current standard, plus 2 others, one higher and one lower. The estimates were derived for 4 populations: all children in an area, all adults, children with asthma, and all adults with asthma. Moving to the next slide, with regard to the exposure assessment, the exposures for the simulated individuals in each of these populations were estimated using the agency's population-based air pollutant exposure model, APEX, that links spatial and temporally varying ambient air ozone concentrations with study area population demographics, human activity data, and physiological attributes of study populations. The model estimates the complete time series of ozone exposures, minute by minute, hourly, daily, etc., and simultaneously occurring breathing rates for the simulated individuals as they perform activities within the microenvironments that they visit. This tracking of both concentrations and breathing rates is important because of the role of ventilation rate with regard to health effects. Based on these time series, the model counts the number of simulated people experiencing ozone concentrations at selected levels and at exertion rates of interest. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we used APEX model outputs in two types of risk characterizations. In the comparison to benchmarks, we estimate the number and percent of the simulated populations in each study area estimated to experience exposures at or above benchmarks drawn from controlled human exposure studies. And those benchmarks that we used were 60, 70, and 80 part per billion. Specifically, this involves comparing estimated daily maximum 7-hour average exposure concentrations while at elevated ventilation to the benchmark concentrations. This takes into account the full array of effects observed in the controlled human exposure studies that some of which Mary Hudson mentioned previously. In the lung function characterization, we estimate the number and percent of simulated populations in each study area estimated to experience lung function decrements of different magnitudes, 10%, 15%, or 20%. The assessment presents the lung function risk estimates derived via two different approaches. The first is using an exposure response function based on observed responses in the 6.6-hour studies. And the second is using a model based on the concept of estimated accumulated dose, also derived using the controlled human exposure data set. There are uncertainties associated with both types of risk estimation and some additional uncertainties that apply only to the estimation of lung function risk. So turning to the next slide. Turning to the findings of the assessment, first, some overall observations. We note a strength of the comparison to benchmarks characterization is that it allows us to consider the full array of effects observed in the controlled human exposure studies at different levels. This includes the effects that Mary Hudson mentioned, lung function decrements, respiratory symptoms, as well as inflammation, as well as airway responsiveness at higher concentrations. In terms of the results of the assessment in general, we see, in terms of the percent of population group, a higher percentage of children than adults with exposures estimated at or above benchmarks. And this is due to the greater frequency and amount of time spent outdoors at elevated exertion by children versus adults. Secondly, we see similar estimates for people with asthma versus all people. And this is due to the use of similar activity patterns, time outdoors, and time at elevated exertion. So stepping back, in comparing the current assessments with the comparable one done for the 2015 review, and focusing on the air quality scenario for the current standard, we note that while there are differences, the 2020 exposure and risk estimates for air quality conditions just meeting the current standard are generally similar to those from the 2015 review. A number of improvements have been made and uncertainties have been reduced since the 2015 review in a number of areas and also further characterized in others. The appendix includes a slide that lists some of these areas, and they're detailed in the draft PA. So turning to some specific quantitative results and focusing on the comparison to benchmarks analysis for the air quality scenario in each study area just meeting the current standard. Across the 8 study areas, we see that less than 0.1% of children with asthma on average were estimated to experience as much as 1 day exposure at or above 80 part per billion, and no simulated individuals were estimated to experience more than 1 day. And you'll recall that at 80 part per billion, there's a wide array of effects that have been documented in the controlled human exposure studies. With regard to the 70 part per billion benchmark concentration, which is below the exposure associated with a combination of statistically significant lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms, less than 1% of children with asthma, on average, were estimated to experience as much as 1 day at or above 70. Less than 0.1% were estimated to experience more than a day. And lastly, even in the highest year across all study areas, less than 5% of children with asthma were estimated to experience more than one day with an exposure at or above 60 part per billion. And I believe that's the last slide for the quantitative analyses.
So this slide is a summary of the preliminary conclusions for the primary standard. First, the health effects evidence newly available in the 2020 ISA, as mentioned, is generally consistent with the evidence based in the 2015 review. The key evidence continues to be those 6.6 hour controlled human exposure studies with exercise. 73 parts per billion, as Deirdre mentioned, is the lowest exposure associated with an adverse combination of lung function decrements and respiratory symptoms. And 60 parts per billion is the lowest exposure associated with any statistically significant respiratory response. At-risk populations continue to include children and people of all ages with asthma. The 2020 exposure risk analyses for the air quality just meeting the current standard estimate generally similar levels of protection as in the 2015 risk and exposure analyses. Specifically, more than 99.9% of children with asthma are estimated to be protected from even a single exposure at or above 80 parts per billion, and 100% from multiple exposures. More than 99% are protected from even a single exposure at or above 70 parts per billion, and more than 99.9% are protected from experiencing multiple exposures. And finally, more than 95% are protected from experiencing multiple exposures at or above 60 parts per billion. Thus, the draft PA concludes that the available evidence and quantitative information, including the uncertainties, do not call into question the adequacy of the protection provided by the current standard, and thus support consideration of retaining the current standard without revision. So accordingly, the draft PA does not identify alternative standards for further evaluation. Next slide. So this is the last slide on the primary standard. It's a list of the charge questions for the panel with regard to the primary standard. I won't read all of them to you, but in general, the questions are intended to get the panel's view on the approach taken in the draft policy assessment in considering the key aspects of the health effects evidence and the risk assessments in informing the preliminary conclusions and the rationale for these preliminary conclusions, along with the panel's view on various limitations and uncertainties, as well as areas for additional research. So I'm happy to take some clarifying questions now on the primary standard, or if you prefer to wait to the end, I can hand it over to Lee to discuss the secondary standard.
Let's pause for a minute and see if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question. Mark.
Yes, thank you. And this, Jeremy already asked this question, but I just wanted to confirm. So with regard to the primary standard, these analyses are the same as the 2020 PA, is that right?
Correct.
Is anything different that we ought to know about?
Nope, there's nothing nothing different with regard to the evidence base used to consider the primary standard. Is there anything else that I?
The analyses were the same also, is that right?
Yeah, the risk and exposure analyses were the same, and they were very similar to the risk and exposure analyses that were done for the 2015 review.
Yeah, thank you.
Very consistent between the two.
Anyone else have any clarifying questions or comments? Yes, George.
So I noticed toward the end of that presentation that it sounds like EPA is putting more emphasis on the controlled human exposure studies, the 6.6 hour, at XXX ppb, than the fairly rich literature base of the epidemiology that's out there. Is that correct? And if it is, so what's the rationale behind that?
So the both the 2015 decision and the 2020 decision put more emphasis on the controlled human exposure studies, because the exposure circumstances are harder to associate. The epi studies provide supporting evidence, but the actual exposures of concern and exposure circumstances are harder to interpret on the epi side. Is there anything else I should add there, Deirdre?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's not quite fair to say we put more necessarily. It's that the full evidence base supports the decision, and obviously those different types of studies provide different things in providing support. And as Mary has said, the controlled human exposures document very specifically conditions that cause specific effects in a controlled setting. The epidemiological studies provide a broader view and allow you to consider more severe outcomes. For example, as was mentioned in some of the earlier slides, the increases in emergency room visits, et cetera, associated with asthma, that together pull together the conclusions about the severity of the effect that can occur and the at-risk populations.
Okay, thank you.
Deidre, excuse me, Christina.
Thank you. So my question is, since the same risk assessment methodology was used in 2015 and 2020, was there any evaluation of using other methods of evaluating risk? Were those considered? And if so, why or why not were any other alternatives considered?
So I'll back up just to make sure I've captured what you're asking. So in this draft PA, the risk and exposure assessment is the assessment that was performed in 2020 and is also documented in the 2020 PA. That assessment is an update, an improvement over the assessments that were performed in the prior 2015 review. And so there was a whole in the integrated review plan, which was published in 2019. There was a whole consideration of limitations and uncertainties associated with the quantitative exposure risk analyses that were done in the prior 2015 review. And based on that evaluation, decisions were made on what to do with regard to the quantitative analyses in 2015. So there was a full consideration of what would be appropriate to improve on and go forward with analyses at that time. I'm hopeful that gets at what you're asking, Dr. Fuller.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Ed. Evil.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not sure quite how to best formulate it and how to address it. This is more on the exposure estimation side than on the health side. I understand that the health data was taken into account, et cetera, based on the 2015, 2020 data. My question is, with changing considerations in terms of climate change, changing considerations in terms of wildfire smoke and downwind photochemistry. I just wonder, although we say we're looking at 2020 and we're not going to look forward, that's going to be the next cycle of exposure. I just wonder if we're missing something in terms of thinking about exposure trends and increased downwind exposures and changing concentrations and thus changing the exposure prediction, the number of people potentially at risk. And so again, I'm not quite sure how to frame the question to whether those exposure trends are appropriately captured in this review, or if we're going to say, well, we'll pick it up in 2025, or if we're not using the data that's out there.
Right. And of course, we do the review periodically, as was described in the prior presentation, and that's one reason perhaps why we do. But I would also emphasize that the quantitative exposure assessments that were done focused on specific air quality scenarios, and it was taking air quality that represented conditions just meeting the current standard. We use the phrase design values as a way to characterize conditions that just meet the current standard. And so it's saying that And it takes different patterns of concentrations that might meet the current standard. That's why we have 8 different study areas, but it's a constrained air quality scenario that we're assessing. And then we additionally assessed 2 other scenarios where we had a design value that was higher and a design value lower. So we're not doing an assessment of either current or existing air quality in study areas or a projection on future air quality. That's not part of the way these exposure assessments are done to inform the standards decision. There is a separate activity that's often done when a standard is changed that's called a regulatory impact analysis. And in that, there is often modeling that looks at current conditions and then layering on the expected controls from existing regulations and projecting into the future. And so that becomes something of interest as well. So I think your question is an interesting one, and there are different ways to consider it. But in terms of the exposure assessments to inform the decision on the standard, we're looking at scenarios intended to be quite specific to those air quality scenarios. Does that get at it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I have some other issues, but I understand the premise. So thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. And we will obviously have lots of time to deliberate the details after we've read these documents. So anyone else have any questions or comments before we turn it back over to EPA? Oh, Catherine.
Thank you. This is kind of echoing, I think, maybe George's comment earlier, as as someone that thinks about early life exposures, children, infants, I am struck, and I'm new to this process. I have not been involved in the Case Act before, but by the sort of emphasis on these controlled human studies. While I understand the ease with translatability, I think it doesn't help us as well with understanding the impacts on children's health, because we don't have the same evidence base for controlled human exposures to children or young children or infants. And some of the concerning health impacts might not be those short-term effects, but rather the impact on the lung growth trajectory and implications for ongoing lifelong health. So have there been previous considerations of ways to bring in, those concerns that aren't well characterized by the controlled human studies?
Well, I think that that's an area of uncertainty that we've recognized in the assessment. And so there are a lot of very talented researchers out there that we would encourage you to come up with creative ways of looking at that. Anything else to add?
I would just add that you'll see as you review the draft PA that considering uncertainties and considering how to view those uncertainties in terms of our understanding of risk to at-risk populations is an important aspect of the policy assessment, and an important aspect, and it is an important aspect of the policy assessment because it's an important aspect of the administrator's judgment in making decisions on the standards. So while you identify a specific issue with regard to the ozone review, in all NAAQS reviews, there will be an area of uncertainty, and we have to consider, based on the information we have, what does that tell us or not tell us, and what are we concerned about with regard to information we do not have. And so the discussion in the PA talks about the extent of any studies that might have been done in adolescents or children in the past, and what can we take from them in terms of whether we think there are differences or similarities, the effects that you identified are considered as well, as in terms of uncertainties. So we'd reach a conclusion based on the information we have, but then we go on to say, what do we think in terms of the characterization of risk to the at-risk populations, because we're focused on a standard that protects the at-risk populations.
All right, thank you, Jason.
Yeah, the results that you showed for the human studies, just to paraphrase it, at 70 part per billion, there was a statistically significant impact, and at 63 parts per billion, it also said statistically significant detriment or something. I didn't catch the words right. Could you briefly describe what the distinction there is? What was observed at 63 that was different than at 70?
So at 73 parts per billion, there was a statistically significant decrease in lung function decrements. So a decrease in, as measured by FEV1, forced expiratory volume. So how much you can blow out air in 1 minute, as well as a significant increase in symptom scores. So during the studies, they have the study subjects take they survey them and ask them, do they have pain on deep inspiration or coughing or those sorts of things. And those two combinations of effects have been acknowledged by the American Thoracic Association, the American Thoracic Society as being in combination as being adverse. So that's what we were focusing on. And at 60 parts per billion, there's a small but statistically significant decrement in FEV1 or the lung function decrements, but there is no statistically significant symptoms observed at 60 parts per billion. So does that help?
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more hands up. I'm going to assume that people would have done that by now. And so I'll invite EPA to proceed with your review of the secondary standard.
Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Lee Meyer, and I'm going to walk you through the considerations on the PA in regards to the secondary standard. To orient you with the information considered in this draft PA, I start with first a reminder that the current secondary standard was established in 2015 and based primarily on welfare evidence for vegetation effects and air quality analysis with a focus on protection against cumulative exposures associated with growth-related impacts of concern. And as we've discussed previously, this PA is relying on the 2020 ISA for the welfare effects evidence base. Additionally, some quantitative exposure risk analyses have been expanded and updated from those in the 2020 PA. And these include peak concentration analyses that were previously presented in technical memos supporting the 2020 decision, as well as updates to air quality data and all analyses to include a more recent time period. Next slide. The PA addresses the overarching question, again, of whether the available scientific evidence and exposure risk information calls into question the adequacy of the welfare protections afforded by the current secondary standard by considering a series of specific questions. These are related to photochemical oxidants other than ozone with regard to their abundance in ambient air and their potential for welfare effects, the nature of the welfare effects associated with ozone exposure, public welfare implications of such effects, exposures and potential for public welfare effects under conditions that are currently meeting the current standard, and the important uncertainties, either new or remaining from the 2015 review. Next slide, please. In regard to, you can go back, yeah. In regard to the welfare effects evidence included in this PA, the nature of effects remains generally consistent with the 2020 decision. Effects found to be causally related to ozone include visible foliar injury, effects on plant growth and reproduction, effects on crop yield and quality, and various ecosystem level effects. The effects found likely to be causal include carbon sequestration in terrestrial ecosystems and on ecosystem watering cycling, as well as other effects. The draft PA recognizes public welfare considerations that include the type of effect, public uses of potentially impacted areas and associated public values, the extent of the potentially impacted areas, and the severity and extent of potential impacts. I'm sorry. Sorry, did I skip a slide? No, I think, yeah, okay. The array I think we're on different slides. I'm sorry.
No, one more. No, one more.
One more.
Yeah, I think we needed to, they didn't turn. And now one more. Right? You're on Growthly?
No, I'm the one prior. Sorry. It was skipping around on, yeah, there for just a second. The array of effects varies with regard to the availability of established quantitative relationships with ozone exposure metrics that inform our understanding of risk under conditions meeting the current standard. Uncertainties remain from the 2015 review and with the new evidence. And we also note that the longstanding evidence documents the importance of cumulative effects and the need for attention to high hourly concentrations. Okay, now we can leave this slide. So the next 3 slides will go through several categories of effects and describe the extent of the information to support the quantitative relationships with ozone. With regard to growth-related effects, the evidence continues to support the use of reduced growth in tree seedlings in terms of relative biomass loss as a surrogate for a full range of growth-related effects, as was used in the 2015 decision. In this context, we use W126 index as an exposure metric, which is a cumulative concentration weighted index. We note that the 2015 standard was based on generally limiting the cumulative exposures to those for which median relative biomass loss estimates would be somewhat below 6%. The PA focuses on established quantitative exposure response functions that are available for seedlings of 11 tree species and are based on studies involving a wide range of multiple exposure concentrations. There are some notable uncertainties associated with estimates for exposure circumstances under the standard, which are appreciably different from many exposures in the studies supporting the functions. The data sets have very limited representation of exposure levels at ozone concentrations that would meet the current standard, and they include W126 levels extending well above 25 part per million hours and numerous hours of concentrations at or above 100 parts per billion. There are also uncertainties related to aspects of the ER function derivation. Next slide. In regard to visible foliar injury, the PA notes that a quantitative relationship of severity or incidence in natural areas has not been established with a specific ozone metric. Studies of relationships between ozone exposure and incidence and severity of leaf injury suggest a role for a peak concentration occurrence as well as cumulative exposures. The PA includes analyses of a data set developed from 6 years of Forest Service scores at biosites in 39 states, and the W126 index and soil moisture estimates for the sites indicate that visible foliar injury of some extent occurs at a range of W126 index estimates. Across W126 bins, biosite scores and incidence is variable, with incidence and severity increasing at the highest W126 index estimates, such as those above 25 part per million hours. Those estimates are not observed at locations that are meeting the current standard. The current evidence is limited with regard to considering and judging public welfare significance of different levels of severity and extent of injury. Next slide. With regard to climate effects, PA finds that while tropospheric abundance of ozone is causally related to radiative forcing and likely causally related to effects on temperature, precipitation, and related variables, there is appreciable uncertainty associated with understanding quantitative relationships involving regional ground level ozone concentrations and climate effects on tropospheric ozone on a global scale. The PA also recognizes the newly identified effects, plant insect signaling and the insect herbivore effects, but lacks information on relative exposure metrics and quantitative ER relationships. Next slide. As previously stated, PA includes updated air quality and exposure analyses to include the most recent 3-year period, as well as the historical record dating to 2000 of the last 21 3-year periods that U.S. monitoring cites. The positive relationship between W126 and design values for the current standard documents that reductions in design values are associated with reductions in W126 index. Lower peak concentrations and fewer occurrences of high concentration, such as those N100s, hours over 100 parts per billion, at sites meeting the current standard, indicate the control exerted by the form and averaging time of the current standard. At monitoring sites across the US that met the current standard, W126 values rarely approached index levels associated with the 6% relative biomass loss. Next slide. The PA makes a series of preliminary conclusions, which I'll go over here. We note that the welfare effects evidence is generally consistent with the evidence base in the 2015 review. In regard to growth-related effects, evidence supports the use of our relative biomass loss as a surrogate for a broader array of vegetation-related effects, and its consideration in context of air quality and exposure conditions in areas meeting the current standard. In regard to visible foliar injury, the evidence does not indicate air quality conditions associated with elevated severity or extensive leaf damage to be occurring in areas that meet the current standard. And in regard to climate effects, the evidence does not support climate risk estimation for ozone concentrations that meet the current standard. The air quality and exposure analyses indicate that the current standard controls for both W126 levels and peak hourly concentrations, which provide protection from air quality conditions associated with the vegetation-related risks of concern. The preliminary conclusion presented in the PA is that the available evidence and quantitative information, including the uncertainties, do not call into question the adequacy of protection provided by the current standard, and thus support consideration of retaining the current standard without revision. And accordingly, the draft PA here does not identify alternative standards for further evaluation. Next slide. Here we present a list of charge questions that are associated with the secondary standard and ask the panel for their view on several key issues. We ask their views on the approach to considering the evidence for welfare effects and quantitative air quality and exposure analyses to inform the preliminary conclusions. We ask to what extent the evaluation of the available evidence is technically sound and clearly communicated. We ask the panel if the discussion provides an appropriate and sufficient rationale in supporting the preliminary conclusion that is appropriate to consider retaining the standard without revision. And we ask the panel for their views regarding the areas for additional research identified and other areas that should be highlighted. With that, I will close this presentation and hand it back to our chair.
Thank you very much for that. I open it up now to the panel for any clarifying questions or comments you wish to ask.
Could I ask a question? I can't find the raise hand signal here on the Zoom.
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. If I understand correctly, the W126 metric is calculated for the 3 months with the highest total W126. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's seasonal average, yes.
Yeah, okay. I was just wondering if you've considered that as the ozone has come down in recent years, especially in the East Coast. I don't know if it happens on the West or the Midwest, but there's a definite shift in the month with the maximum W126 to earlier in the spring. And at least in the work that I did in the Smokies, that included the month of April. And right where I am, we are only just now getting leaves on the trees. And if you go to any higher elevations, or maybe in the upper Midwest, maybe New England, they may not have leaves out yet. So if we just willy-nilly do that 3-month maximum, we may be having a month where the trees don't have any leaves on them, and it would not be a relevant thing to do. So I'm wondering if there's some consideration to time that to when the trees that are going to be susceptible to the ozone are, actually have their leaves on them.
That's a great consideration. I personally don't know if there is a set range of months that they'll, would shift like that, but maybe Deirdre, do you have any comment to add to that?
I'll just augment what you said, Dr. Neufeld is right. It's the maximum 3-month period. So if that maximum 3-month period includes April, that will be what's compared to the W126 index targets. And it sounds like what you're saying is that might be more conservative than needed in the Appalachians, because that wouldn't be a time period when those trees would actually be at particular risk. And so it strikes me that's an uncertainty in that regard, but it's going to shift bias in that direction. Am I following?
Yeah, because essentially 1/3 of the index might be happening when the trees are the least susceptible, because when they don't have leaves on it, they don't react to the ozone. So you wouldn't catch then the same effect as if you moved it a little later when they did have leaves. Yeah.
Good comment. Thanks.
Anyone else have a question or comment?
Could I bring up one other comment?
Please, this is your chance.
Okay. So this is related to the interaction between different pollutants. And maybe it's covered and I just haven't had time yet to get to it. But for example, PM and ozone may have substantial co-occurrences, I think, in certain areas. And I'm wondering, has anyone given consideration to the possibility that the response to one of the pollutants interacts with the response to the other pollutants, such that if you look at these pollutants all as silos, and separate from each other without regard to the other pollutants, maybe we have a wrong risk assessment. So for example, if there's high ozone and there's high PM, maybe people tolerate lower levels when they're combined, as opposed to if you look at them individually. Is that taken into consideration somehow, or are these co-occurrences so rare as to not be important?
Yeah. Your question? Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Deirdre.
I wasn't positive the way you phrased it, if you were focused on plants or people.
Well, it could be both, but I'm thinking primarily for this interaction with people.
Sure. And of course, as we've emphasized, we rely on the evidence characterized in the ISA. And so to the extent there are studies that help us to understand any increased susceptibility to ozone and ozone effects that is contributed by different levels of particulate matter, then we would try to consider that. So it's a function of the evidence that we have. I'm not aware that we have particularly strong or many at all studies that specifically look at that. I'm sure there are some.
Any additional questions about either the secondary standard welfare effects or actually anything? And I mean, today, we just got all the materials last night. So recognizing that people haven't really had a chance to absorb things independently. And but the purpose of today's meeting is really for us to get a briefing from EPA and set the stage for us to do our more thorough review. And we will have 4 separate meetings. If we need all 4, we have 4 on the calendar to have in-depth discussion about all these topics. But this is a good opportunity for us today to address any clarifying questions or other aspects that will facilitate our in-depth review that we'll be doing over the next time period. So I invite anybody on the panel who has any additional questions or comments for EPA about anything we've heard today or anything you expect to work on to speak up. So George.
Sure, since for a wide open topic, one question that as I go through and read these documents, I know in previous reviews, there has been discussion on US background, previously known as policy relevant background. And I guess the question to EPA would be, when considering that as part of the overall exposure mix, I think, and this is where I need to get clarity on, we should not be considering that background when we assess what an appropriate primary or secondary, for that matter, maybe it's even more important for the secondary, next standard should be. And then the second part of that question is, assuming that's correct, does consideration of background come into play during the implementation of a standard? So it's really a two-part question.
Right. So I'll try and reframe it. It may be that Erica wants to broaden it to your latter part. But yes, in terms of the standard, the judgment on the standard is focused on whether or not the current standard, regardless of sources of ozone, provides protection, the targeted protection of public health with adequate margin of safety for the primary side, and protection against known or anticipated adverse environmental effect on the secondary side. And so it doesn't need to consider whether the ozone comes from background or not. As you are, I'm sure, aware, having your experience on different ozone panel reviews, there have been several court decisions, and OGC may want to weigh in here too as well, that talk about when you're revising a standard, whether or not there are considerations as to proximity of a ozone standard to the ozone that would be expected solely from background. But as a summary statement, the standard needs to be protective of public health and welfare, regardless.
Okay, yeah, I mean, because there's quite a bit of literature out there, even some of it very recent, suggesting that there's not much headroom in some areas, particularly on the West Coast, high elevations. Does that get taken into consideration during implementation? Because we've seen historically a lot of pushback from certain parties on a more protective standard because of that. And so the question would be, given that sometimes there's not a lot of headroom, does background get taken into consideration during implementation?
I don't know if Erica or Melina Williams from our Office of General Counsel, or David Orlin from General Counsel wants to weigh in on that.
Deirdre, I can say just a couple words on that. So there are some specific mechanisms that can be used in terms of implementation that give some degree of relief to areas due to background. And I'm sure you're familiar with exceptional events, which can be used to exclude days, measured concentration on specific days if they're due to exceptional events, from determining whether an area is in violation of the standard. That's limited because it's not kind of general background, but it has to be an event-driven episode like stratospheric intrusion or fires or something that can be identified as an event. And then there's also the 179B provision, which can be used by areas to prevent them from being bumped up from a marginal to a moderate attainment status if they can show that they would have met the standard, but for international sources of ozone. So those are some of the relief mechanisms that are used on the implementation side, but that it's not kind of a complete or blanket relief for areas that are that experience high background ozone concentrations.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.
All right, looks like Jason has his hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but the WHO, World Health Organization, last fall created a new standard for ozone. Not standard, but they call it a guideline, right? New guideline for ozone. And some of, and it's pretty tight. I appreciate the EPA goes through its own process that's different from WHO's and has its own reasons for reaching the conclusions they do. I wonder if we might take a look at what the process and logic was for WHO standard, but another reason why I thought of raising it was because it uses the 8-hour metric, but it uses a 6-month average of the 8-hour metric. And there is some logic behind that. I wondered a bit to the extent to which the metric itself, or the form as it was called, so the fourth highest of daily 8 hours, would be up for discussion here.
So, sorry, I'll jump in. I think what you're asking is, so in a standards review, we try and look at the first question of, do we have an adequate, is the current standard providing, or let me back up, does the existing evidence and quantitative information support or call into question the adequacy of protection for those existing standards? If the answer is yes, we tend to not move on to something else. That's the process we've been using for a long time. If the answer is, well, there's something that's calling into question the adequacy of protection, then we start exploring what might alternatives be. And in that exploration, I think we would get into the issue you're raising, is what aspects of the standard might be appropriate to modify in order to provide the protection that the administrator might be seeking. And that was mentioned by Erica Sasser at the beginning. When we talk about alternatives, we think of all elements of the standard. We might not simply change a level, we might change the averaging time, we might change the statistical form. There are different ways to look at it. Once we're in that realm of thinking, oh, we might need to look at something else because the current standard is not providing the protection needed. Does that?
Okay, thanks.
Any other, oh, George.
Yep, I'm back. This is probably for ORD. I did not spend a lot of time looking at the most recent ISA, although I guess I probably will be as part of this review, come up to speed on that. But I was, so I wasn't aware that there was a change in the causality assessment. I guess it's for short-term mortality and cardiovascular effects from likely suggestive, which would be the 2011 ISA, somewhere back there, changed to suggestive, but not sufficient to infer causality. It's unusual for the causality assessments to move in that direction. Usually they go in the opposite direction as we, gain more information. Is there could someone from ORD maybe explain in short, very quick summary what was behind, what drove that shift in causality?
And I'm just, do we have Steve Dutton still on, or who? Yes, Steve, thanks.
Yep. Hi. Yeah. Thank you for that question. And yeah, that was a change that was made between the 2013 ISA and the 2020 ISA. And yes, it was a I guess a downward shift in that causality conclusion. One thing to point out is that in early drafts of that of the 2013 ISA, there were also some juggling between the causal determination on those categories. So that's really one where we've had a lot of differing advice, and the new evidence that came in between 2013 and 2020 really pushed us kind of back down to that lower category. So that one has kind of gone back and forth quite a bit.
Okay, so it sounds like even back in 2013 was kind of on the edge and it's just rolling back and forth.
Yeah, that's correct. And the new evidence, is mixed, and both on the epi side and on control human exposure. So kind of I think with the 2013 ISA, if I recall, we had 3 drafts and then a final, and it was at that lower category through most of those drafts. But then we went with CASAC advice based on the evidence in 2013 to increase the causal statement there. But then with the added information that came in that increment, it went back down to the lower category.
Well, that's interesting. Thank you. I mean, because that particular category, anything involving mortality, obviously, is important. So as it shifts back and forth, that's not a small change. That's good to know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And this, I think, highlights, even though we're not charged with reviewing the ISA, that there may be aspects of the ISA that we really need to dig into in order to understand and give high quality advice to EPA about the policy assessment. And we may be relying more on some of us who have already done that, including Mark, who has his hand up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I actually went back and was looking at some of the comments I had written on the PA review and the CASAC letter for the ISA review. And yeah, I was not in support of that decision to lower the cardiovascular mortality issue or cardiovascular effects. But if I recall, that was driven by the inconsistency of cardiovascular effects in the human clinical studies. But I thought there was not enough weight placed on the epidemiologic evidence. And I thought that the reason for the inconsistency in the human studies were not adequately considered, the reasons that why they might differ from the epi findings. So I thought that was, I certainly did not agree with that approach, and that's and that affected then, of course, how the PA was done, because the PA considers only those endpoints that are determined to be causal or likely to be causal. So so it was an important change, and may be a subject for some of our discussion to come.
Thank you for bringing that to our attention and providing that extra context for the past review, since we are conditioning on that. Terry.
So in thinking about that, going back to the CASAC review of the reconsideration of the PMPA, where only those things that were causal or maybe likely to be causal were included in our assessment. So would that knock what Mark just talked about? Would that knock it out as from our consideration? Will that not be a charge question?
I'm not sure who are you asking that of EPA? I'm sorry, Dr. Gordon. Or
I'm not sure who writes the charge questions, or if it's collaboration between Leanne and you. But
so the charge questions on the PA are posted on the website, and we do not have a charge question on the ISA because we have not reopened the ISA and prepared a new draft. So there is not a question with regard to the ISA. There, as Erica Dr. Sasser said earlier, we always look for CASAC advice if we are missing something. But no, we do not. There's not a charge question specific to those endpoints. The PA builds off the ISA. So based on the conclusions in the 2020 ISA, it recognizes that the current conclusion with regard to those endpoints is that the evidence is suggestive, and therefore it does not give great weight to consideration of those endpoints.
Yeah, Terry, I think it was a little different in the PM review because we had the supplemental ISA, and that was kind of a special case. And I think for the supplemental ISA, they decided only to consider new literature for the endpoints that were causal, basically. So it's a slightly different issue than for the PA.
Okay.
We are free as CASAC to address any aspects of this scientific question. So if members of the panel feel like we need to go back and revisit that decision, I think that is a choice that we are free to make. That is not anything that EPA has asked us to do. So EPA does create the charge questions, and our typical practice is to adhere to the charge questions and follow them, but that we're certainly not restricted to that. But we normally do that. So
thank you.
Maybe you want to elaborate a little, that would be helpful also.
Yeah, I can just kind of picking up a little bit more on some of the conclusions from the 2020 ISA that resulted in that lowering of that causality rating. So yeah, it was mentioned there's a kind of an increased body of controlled human exposure studies that came out in that increment between 2013 and 2020. And in particular, in 2013, there was one study that really drove that increase. But in the time since then, there were additional studies that kind of had varying results. There was more studies, but there was kind of less consistency in the evidence overall that we were finding. But it was also, that was combined with a growing body of epi evidence that was also providing kind of inconsistent or little positive evidence for these more severe cardiovascular morbidity endpoints as well. And then, of course, uncertainties from inadequate evidence of confounding with co-pollutants was also kind of raised the uncertainty around that category.
Thank you. George.
And this gets back to my question a while ago about, the perhaps more emphasis on the controlled human exposure studies than the EPI, and which drives which. Does the EPI support the controlled exposure studies, or vice versa? I'm a little concerned that, especially in this kind of health outcome, cardiovascular outcomes, that relying on the controlled human exposure studies, because they're so small and presumably conducted on healthy people, that it could easily miss some of these cardiovascular health endpoints, and that to base the change in causality, the downgrading, primarily on those makes me a little nervous. That's something I think hopefully we can talk more about, and even if it's not in a charge question, sometimes I think we tend to focus on the charge questions a lot, and sometimes, at least in the previous PM reconsideration, I think they led us a little astray. So I would be cautious on putting too much weight on the charge questions. And here's one topic that I hope we can focus more on.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. And since we haven't had a chance to make charge question assignments, we'll consider how we're going to address this topic when we set that up next week. Any other questions, comments, discussion from anyone? I'm not seeing any. So I'm thinking that we have finished our work for today and we can close the meeting. As I mentioned, we, the royal we, meaning Aaron on my behalf, will be following up with charge question assignments next week. And we all have the next 4 meetings on our calendar, and we recognize that given we're headed into vacation season, not everybody can make every meeting, and we're sorry that it was impossible to find excellent dates that would work for everyone. But we will see you then in June. And I think, unless there are any last comments from anyone from the panel, I will turn it over to Aaron to adjourn the meeting. Oh, Steve wanted to say something first.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I did just thought of one other thing that we mentioned, Erica mentioned, is that we do have the provisional memo, which addressed some newer controlled human exposure studies as well, 8 additional ones, including some looking at cardiovascular. So you have that as well available for you to look through.
Thank you. That's helpful to remind us of that as well. So I think, Aaron, you may close the meeting, I think.
Yes, thank you everyone for your participation in the meeting today. We will be in touch with further action items, and we will see everyone again on Zoom in June. Thank you. We can be adjourned.
Okay. Thank you.